the flickering light of Asia, or the Assyrian nation and church. Perhaps of all the Assyrians, the sister of the patriarch received the heaviest blow. Her youngest brother was studying in Constantinople when Turkey declared war, and from there he was sent to some unknown destination and killed by the Turks. Her eyes were not yet clear of their flood of tears when she was crushed again by the sight of the slain body of her patriarch brother, to whom she had become a mother as well as a sister. But after the assassination of Marshamun, the entire burden of the Assyrian nation rested upon her womanly shoulders. It appears that she was raised and prepared to become a captain of her people's ship in the midst of these unforeseen storms. Even after the succession of Marcianopoulos to the patriarchal see, she retained the leadership of her people and conducted the affairs of her nation with the patriotism of a Deborah and with the personality of an empress. If the story of the great Semiramis fails to receive a full credit of authenticity, the Assyrian nation surely produced a second queen in the person and in the charming character of Lady Surma. In her younger days, Providence placed this brilliant woman in immediate contact with the fine culture of Great Britain. The learned missionaries of the Archbishop I of Canterbury's mission to the Assyrians saw in her brilliant mind great possibilities for mental development. They accordingly spared no effort in giving proper education to the young princess of Kuchanis. Most prominent young Assyrians persistently asked for her hand in marriage, but she chose to consecrate her noble womanhood to the cause of her father's church and for the uplift of her people. And this voluntary sacrifice on her part endeared her to all shades and all classes of the Assyrian people. In her educational training, she is a monumental of praise and credit to those missionaries of England who, prompted by the love of Christ, had preferred the solitude of the mountains to the luxuries of Urmia. Lady Surma will remain like a brilliant gem to sparkle in the crown of England's missionary enterprise. The apostles of Great Britain went to Kurdistan inspired by the teachings of the great apostle and determined to become the Romans with the Romans, in order to lift up the Assyrians to the level of their own culture, and Lady Surma is an example of that sweet and humble and holy service. In addition to her educational attainments, Lady Surma in her martyr years revealed that the presence of a superb intellect and exalted mind. If Marshamun Benyamin was the real commander of the ship, Lady Surma's hand often controlled with helm over the treacherous sea of the pan-Islamic policies. She was a constant companion of her martyred brother and always present in the councils of the leaders of her people. She indeed relieved her patriarch brother of many responsibilities that would naturally interfere with the functions of his spiritual office. As she grew in graceful conduct, in wisdom, and devotion to the cause of her people, as well as in power, she became the very embodiment of her foreign teachers' aspirations in behalf of the house of Kuchanis and of the welfare of the Assyrian nation and church. It is indeed impossible to write of Lady Surma without speaking a word as to the true spirit of the mission work in the foreign lands. The missionaries of England typified the spirit of the early apostles. They did not regard themselves as members of a race superior to their fellow men, but rather as debtors to their grace that had given them both the environment and the opportunities for acquiring that which they so richly possessed. Hence, instead of exalting themselves and maintaining an exclusive circle for their social intercourse, they went down to the level of a people poorer than their own, and coming pitiably below the measure of their own learning and culture. Their accustomed manner of living was left entirely instead. They adopted the customs and behind, and the costumes of their less fortunate brethren. They forgot they were British. They became real Assyrians in order to elevate the people and help them to work out their own destiny. The real sword of the Spirit is always drawn out of its sheath of humility. Christian weapons, when clothed with covers of pride and conceit and egotism, lose entirely their value and become completely ineffective. It was therefore impossible for Lady Surma, as she found herself growing by leaps and bounds above her fellows, not to have cultivated the noble trait that had made so much impression upon her character during her younger days. Because of frailty, of the successor of Mardbenyamin, Lady Surma assumed the reins of authority and commenced to lead and guide her people to some haven of comparative safety. When the final exodus of the people from Urmia became inevitable, she, like Israel's Deborah, led the Assyrian exiles through the stormiest weather the earth had ever witnessed, and with them she arrived in the camp of Bakuba. In Mesopotamia, Lady Surma was destined to weather storms, perhaps fiercer than those that had driven her people into exile. The great personality of Mardbenyamin, which had impelled submission from all classes of the people, was left buried with his slain body in the bloody plains of Salamas. Marpolus, soon after the arrival of the refugees in Bakuba, succumbed to the ravages of his lung disease, which was aggravated by the fearful plight of his people and his flock. Sectarian interests now commenced to lash the exiles' camp into fury. Misguided and misinformed, the Persian Assyrians began to bolt and showing an intense desire to return to their former kilns, which they were induced to associate with the leek and the onions of Urmia. The media agitators were a band of the Assyrian parasites to whose class an allusion is made in these pages. But back of this disgraceful propaganda were the other personal interests of which I refrain to speak in this narrative. At any rate, the unity of the Assyrian people was sadly disrupted, and the very hope which had stimulated the Assyrians to make such gigantic sacrifices was cast to the winds. It was an act of sheer insanity. But who can ever convince a madman that he is insane? Lady Surma and her two brothers, General David Effendi on the right and Zia on the left. Gen David is now commander-in-chief of the Assyrian forces in Upper Mesopotamia. Lady Surmia, in the meanwhile, had come to London to plead the cause of her people. She was received in the capital of the world's greatest empire with princely honors. From the midst of her patriotic boors, she was called back to Mesopotamia to check possible the evil influence of the propagandists, maintain the unity of the people, and encourage the Tish government to redeem the pledge made by Flat's representatives in allotting an area for her people to be known as the New Assyria.